where people look at, say, ions, atoms, or molecules inside of ultra-cold gases or Bose-Einstein condensates. And then all sorts of interesting physics can be looked at. What we will be focusing on, or I will be focusing on exclusively in this talk, is to place a Rydberg atom inside of a Bose-Einstein condensate. And then, among other things, I advocate that for some controlled studies of what happens during decoherence. Right, so as a brief reminder that we probably don't need after all the other talks of what a Rydberg atom is, if you start with your hydrogen atom in the ground state, that's of the size of a Bohr radius, the Rydberg electron orbit. However, as we are increasing the principal quantum number, the orbital radius of the atom scales like the principal quantum number squared. So these atoms get rather quickly relatively big. And then once you're at a 20 principal quantum number, that Rydberg atom is larger than a biomolecule. And at n equal 100, it's larger than some pesky virus or of the size of an optical wavelength. Right, from the context of this talk, now imagine you're putting this actually into some environment that is able to enter the Rydberg electron orbit. Then perhaps it's going to be an advantage if I have one of these really huge atoms, because it's going to affect the environment over a larger range, if that is what I want to see, which I want to see. So the environment in question, however, should be simple enough to understand and describe. And that's very nicely realized by a Bose-Einstein condensate. We've also heard a lot about it. Maybe let me run through this standard cartoon extra fast. Right, so we're just going below the condensation temperature so that all these atoms that normally necessitate a complicated many-body description, they just enter that one giant matter wave. Right, so here maybe in the mathematical form, I can replace my many-body wave function with the three n coordinates by just one macroscopically occupied single-body orbital. Yeah, and then as we have seen, that is described by this Gauss-Pitaevsky equation that really looks like Schrödinger's equation plus the nonlinear bit that depends on the condensate density and essentially describes elastic S-wave scattering of all these atoms once they meet together, right? But the key point here really was that thanks to having an environment as a Bose-Einstein condensate, the whole nasty many-body physics that would be encoded in a many-body wave function where all the atoms are doing their own thing gets boiled down nicely to just one three-dimensional wave function. Right, so then the general idea is going to be to make a qubit out of a Rydberg atom, right, where the two qubit states 0 and 1 are a Rydberg S state and a Rydberg P state, right? So two different angular momentum states. I'm placing those into the Bose-Einstein condensate, and I explain you shortly why it's totally obvious that the condensate will interact differently with the S and the P state, right? So these yellow arrows are my interactions, right? And then you know that, or have to believe me now, that the actual root cause of all decoherence is always that any sort of initial product state of a qubit like this times some initial state of the environment turns into an entangled state of this kind, where psi naught and psi 1 now is a many-body state for the condensate. And it says here, I have interacted with the qubit in 0, and here I have interacted with the qubit in 1. Right? And the key point here is that we found out, or believe I can convince you, that unlike most of your environments that cause decoherence, here one might be able to actually take an image of that sort of also entangled environment state, rather than just looking at the coherence of the qubit itself. All right, to conclude this sort of motivation / introduction, right? So this is not all just crazy theory ideas. It's being done in experiments. The main one that I know about is the one in the group in Stuttgart, where I've taken that image from. So the gray stuff is a usual cylindrical trap Bose-Einstein condensate with maybe 100,000 atoms. And inside they have excited, say, a single Rydberg atom to the n equal 110 state or 202 state. Right? In particular, in the 202 state, the red ball is actually that Rydberg electron orbit. Right? So you see it's become entirely as large as the Bose-Einstein condensate itself. Right? So I guess it's no exaggeration to call this extreme atoms in an extreme environment. I forgot to say, please interrupt me anytime you like. In the end, I can just skip over some things. So any questions until here? So the talk roughly splits into 3 pieces. The first one is going to be Rydberg S atoms, maybe many of them. The second one is going to be a superposition of a S and a P state. And the third one then is going to have many atoms that can be in S and P states, very roughly. Right, so, but let's start it slowly. Right, so already from this let's call it experimental cartoon and my separate cartoon, you can see that these experiments enter a region or a parameter space where you actually have of the order of hundreds or thousands of ground state atoms inside the Rydberg electron orbit. Right, and I guess everyone's, including my intuition, would cry out that this should kill the Rydberg atom. Right, so I guess the simple reason why it doesn't is the nano-Kelvin temperature of the Bose-Einstein condensate. That means that your typical thermal energy simply isn't enough even to cause a transition to adjacent Rydberg state, let alone say ionize it or what. Right, having said that, some sort of mass effects do happen. Right, so experiments have measured the lifetime of the Rydberg atom in the BEC and find it mostly behaves nicely. Maybe the lifetime is reduced by a factor of 2 or factor of 10. Right, so things do happen, but it's not really catastrophic. Right, so what does happen if this green ground state atom ventures into the electron orbit? So now I'm drawing the probability density of the valence electron of the Rydberg atom. The iron core would be that blue ball. And now the ground state atom comes inside. Clearly what can happen is that the electron now scatters off the ground state atom. And that in fact is the dominant interaction. And luckily for us, it happens also again in an S-wave scattering regime. Right, so now this is S-wave scattering between the Rydberg electron and the ground state atom. Right, and then therefore, in that sort of maybe familiar for Bose-Einstein people looking formula, you get the atom electron scattering length and the electron mass. And we can describe it again, like for atom-atom scattering with a contact interaction Fermi pseudopotential. What I actually want though is a potential between a ground state atom and the Rydberg atom as a whole. Right, and now I found the potential between the ground state atom and the Rydberg electron. So I essentially weigh this potential with the probability to find the Rydberg electron anywhere. And that's the Rydberg electron wave function. Right, so the claim is that the net potential between ground state atom and Rydberg atom is this V0 times Rydberg electron probability density. And the atom electron scattering length, at least for elements that I know about, is negative. So you actually get this blue shaped effective potential, right? Which is presumably quite unusual for most of us, right? So it has really all these crazy oscillations and maybe a net averaged attractive character, right? And then since there is actually all sorts of potential wells happening, the natural thing also does occur. That is, the ground state atom can bind here in some sort of bound states of the outer well and forms what is called ultra long range molecules. Right? They're interesting, but in essentially what we're talking about, we want to avoid those. Right? So we claim the experimentalists can go to regimes where those are not being formed. Or we hope, let's say. Okay. And this is also that I can now hope that I essentially describe my Bose-Einstein condensate just as before with the Gauss-Pedelski equation in a homogeneous system. So I, for the moment, don't bother with the trap. Yes?
Isn't there also a atom-atom interaction on top of these, or that is negligible?
Ground state atom is there, that we keep as before. Yeah. Right, but the trap I've taken out, and now essentially the ground state atom Rydberg atom interaction just enters like an external potential. Right, so I'm not attempting to describe the dynamics or motion of the Rydberg atom for now. Right, we're just putting an external potential here. That, however, has that sort of fancy shape I've shown you before. It so happens that this potential typically is gigantically larger than all the other BEC stuff, which means for short times, I just neglect those first 2 bits, and then everyone can solve this equation in their head. Right, so the initial condensate wave function just gets a complex exponential phase factor, e to the minus I Rydberg wave function mod squared times time. Right, so this is called phase imprinting. Right, I'm just changing the complex phase of my condensate wave function by whacking that Rydberg atom in. Right, and however, that depends on the electronic wave function of the Rydberg state. That means it depends on the state of the impurity. Right, so if I'm putting an S Rydberg atom into the condensate, it would imprint that sort of completely symmetric S orbital kind of a thing pattern. And if instead I take a Rydberg P state, you see that sort of characteristic PM equals 0 dumbbell shape of the orbital in the imprinted pattern. So that's been already proposed in that article by others, that it might be interesting to see now the effect of these different electronic states on the condensate. Problem is, it firstly only imprints a phase. You can't directly measure that. It will later convert to a density, but that effect is relatively weak. Right, so something that we've done in collaboration with the Stuttgart group that's actually trying to do this in experiment is see if you now go to parameters where you expect a visible experimental signal, what would that look like? Right, and since the signal for one Rydberg atom is kind of not like a little bit borderline, say, what they've been trying is excite a Rydberg atom in that black box, let it be there until the green box, ionize it in the red box, and then keep repeating this some maybe 40 times. Right, simply to increase the signal. All the while, the excitation laser is tightly focused into the condensate at the center. And then the density of the condensate is supposed to be measured in situ using phase contrast imaging. Right, and we do the same, more or less try to do exactly the same in a 3D Ghosh simulation. Right, and there's many details in the preprint that I won't be able to go through. But essentially, the net feature that we always see is something like this. That's a relative density, relative column density after 10 of these excitations that are sort of a little bit randomly placed here in the middle. Right, so you see there's less density in black in this sort of ring structure and excess density in the middle. And that all sort of seems to make sense if you go back to that potential here that is net attractive. Right, so it pushes this condensate density to the center and then piles up there. So another aspect that we try to explore, and this is like a really massive amount of computer time that's hidden in that innocent looking figure. So we did these 3D truncated Wigner simulations that allow you to distinguish condensate and non-condensed or thermal fraction, essentially to alleviate another concern, which is if I'm doing this brutal Rydberg excitation all the time in the middle of the condensate, isn't that going to heat it up so badly that the Ghosh-Pitevsky equation even no longer works? Right, and what we find is here in the center region where you do the excitations, indeed, you move atoms from condensed to uncondensed as you'd expect. Right, but if you look at the numbers in detail, that's still a relatively small fraction of the overall density. So I would say it doesn't mean any concerns for the Ghosh-Pitevsky equation. Right, and in fact, we can make some almost quantitative contact with earlier experiments that measured this in more detail. Right, so Ghosh-Pitevsky still works out. And lots of, I mean, so essentially that preprint just explores all sorts of details are required or not required for possibly describing future experiments. In an older work that I can't resist advertising one more time here quickly, so we did the similar simulations for two-dimensional condensates and many atoms that are moving, right? So here were sort of 5 Rydberg atoms initially here at these places and then have repelled outwards. They ultimately created these density tracks in the condensate. And that is the bubble chamber that I was mentioning in my title, right? So this reminded us of these particle physics bubble chambers in the sense of you can interrogate the dynamics of these high energy particles by their interaction with this sort of ambient medium. Okay, any questions about that first part? Because I'm done with it now. Right, so that was, say, one or many Rydberg S atoms in the BEC.
How do you change the Rydberg atom number?
Change?
I had a query, small query.
1 second, I have one from the audience.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, oh, sorry.
The Rydberg atom, how does it affect your results?
Say again, sorry.
Position of the Rydberg atoms inside the BEC, how does it affect?
This is included, right? So here in this simulation on this slide, the Rydberg atom is excited in a sort of Gaussian distribution in the center at random. So from among these 10 excitations, we put them in a random place, sort of mimicking imperfect laser focusing.
I see. Okay, thanks.
And your question here, we just, I mean, so the natural thing you normally do if you try to excite Rydberg atoms in a gas is you can have only a few due to something called dipole blockade. Just they interact so strongly, you don't get more than a few. Right? That's also how in the other experiment they get only 1. Right here, it's less extreme. We say we get 5. Okay.
Yeah. When you were investigating whether like putting Rydberg atoms repeatedly in the condensate, whether it is heating it up or not,
yeah.
What did you get on the third graph?
Thank you. Move on, please.
Yes. That is the number of uncondensed atoms, right? So I don't want to go into it, but the method allows you to distinguish condensate and other stuff, right? So thermal atoms that are not phase coherent with the condensate.
So Sebastian, why do you get these two high density peaks there? Is P it is excited to NP state or NS?
Which two?
There are two blobs, no, in middle.
Yeah, that's random, I think, right? So this is the S state, right? And in the average, so we can of course average this now over many realizations, and then it's all symmetric. Right? So this is just 10 excitations, single shot.
So this is the experimental data.
Sorry?
This is the experimental data.
No, I'm not showing you the experimental data.
Sure.
Right, so actually, I mean, the secret behind it, all this, we so far don't agree with the experimental data, right? So there is some things happening that are going beyond what we're showing here. Right? We're trying to figure that out together with them, what exactly that is. And essentially, for now, the theory results show what it should be if we were just exciting as Rydberg states.
Okay.
I can chat with you later about that in private.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, then I'd like to jump to the decoherence now if we have two internal states. And there again, the S and the P state, and sorry for historic reasons, now I have the third different notation for my states. Other than 0, 1, SP, now we have spin down as S and spin up as P. Right? And I told you already, now if you have an S state, you'd imprint the S orbital. If you have a P state, you imprint the P orbital. Now if you have a superposition, what do you imprint? Right? I only have one mean field, so that won't work. Right? So it already indicates we need to go beyond mean field. And if I'm sort of very serious with my earlier kind of formula, I can't go back to that now, right? So we really expect the condensate to go in a superposition of I have imprinted this and I have imprinted this. To build up a general framework to handle this, what we did is to go to that nasty many-body field operator, Waller Hamiltonian, where we allow 3 states, ground states, S states, P states. Then we make it nicely simple again by saying there's only one Rydberg atom for the moment, but many ground state atoms. And for the ground state atoms, let's assume there is a strong mean field, phi naught. And then as usual, we allow these quantum fluctuations around the mean field using these Bogolubov modes U and V and the corresponding ladder operators. Right, so that is being plugged into here. Poor Siddharth had a sort of approximately 2 to 3 years time to calculate the output. Right? And in the end, what comes out is spin boson Hamiltonian that's relatively well known from maybe quantum optics or open quantum system theory. Right? So there's that one pseudo spin, the Rydberg S and P state. There's a system Hamiltonian that for now just has the energy splitting between. I have a bath of harmonic oscillators. And then the crucial bit here is I have a system environment interaction Hamiltonian that essentially says, depending on the spin state of my Rydberg, right, the S or P, I may excite or create phonons or sound waves in the Bose-Einstein condensate. More or less after I've split my Hamiltonian into system stuff and environment stuff, as shown here. Right, so the information is always the system environment coupling. Right, so we can calculate that in principle. It's something like the 3D Fourier transform of the difference between the P density and the S density of the Rydberg electron. Right, and using this now we can calculate environmental correlation functions, and they contain all the information you might possibly need to describe your open quantum system. Right, and they look like this. Might not tell you much. Right, there's two simplistic pieces of information that one can read out, if one's read the book. First one is this time over which the environmental correlation drops to 0, say something like 20, 30 microseconds here. And this is for Rydberg state 40, principal quantum number. That's the memory time of the environment. Right, so afterwards, the BEC has again forgotten that I've whacked a Rydberg atom into it. Right, and the take-home message is this kind of on the long side compared to the dynamics you'd sort of expect on the Rydberg side. Right, so it's a very slow environment. Right, so all sort of BEC stuff is slower than Rydberg stuff in my sort of simplistic thinking. Right? The second interesting piece of information comes out of the value of that Barth correlation function at time 0, sort of the autocorrelation function, from which I can estimate under, I guess, some conditions that I wouldn't know now, I can estimate the decoherence time. Right, and so here we plot for various principal contour numbers that correlation function at 0, and then here I try to translate it into decoherence time. And right, so that's decoherence time if at the beginning at time 0 I'm putting a S plus P superposition of Rydberg state into my BEC. Right, and perhaps unsurprisingly for Rydberg physics, that again can be scaled over orders of magnitude. For principal quantum number 40, I have 20 nanoseconds, and at 120 I have 1 microseconds. And so that makes us relatively optimistic that in between there's some sort of corner where other decoherence effects that might be there and that I'm not looking into are slower. So one can actually see this. Right, and then the coherence of the Rydberg atom I could read out using some microwave spectroscopy or some such. Right, just to show you once how that actually looks like the decoherence, right? So we can, if I just have a Rydberg S and P, like that 50-50 S plus P superposition in my BEC, Hamiltonian looks like this. You see all spin operators are sigma Z, right? So there's nothing in there that couples a Rydberg S state to a Rydberg P state. Hence my Hamiltonian decomposes into 2 blocks, H up, H down, means the Hamiltonian part that handles S, the other one handles P. And inside there, I can more or less separately solve it analytically and numerically through various methods. Due to the same block structure, I know my many-body wave function is always something like some coefficient up plus many-body wave function, BEC wave function for the case that I've put up inside, plus the same for down. Now I want to know the coherence between up and down. Right? So I construct that reduced density matrix by tracing here over the Bose-Einstein condensate state. And you do that, and you find the coherence is given by the overlap of the many-body state in the presence of the S state and the many-body state in the presence of the down state. And this is a completely general result, right? So any sort of qubit decoherence will in principle look like this, that the coherence is given by the overlap of these environmental states for case A and case B, or case 0 and case 1. Right? And like I said, we can calculate those analytically and plot the coherence, 2 times the coherence or something, for n equal 80, and it drops down nicely in agreement with 3 different ways to calculate this. However, what's sort of the more exciting part here for me is now the idea that given this entangled state is really the root cause of all decoherence always, maybe in this system one can actually image the environmental part of it, right? Which I would claim in most other systems you can't. Maybe you can find a way somewhere, but here it's the more natural one. Right, for that first we want to get the Rydberg state out of it again. Right, so say we do another pi-half microwave pulse on the Rydberg state, turns the total state into this guy. I measure the spin and kind of post-select on up. Right, and now I have collapsed the overall state into one that really contains an entangled state also on the BEC side. Namely the one that's a superposition of I have imprinted the S pattern and I've imprinted the P pattern. And how can I see that? Obviously, I wouldn't be asking the silly question if the answer wasn't yes. Right, so we calculated the experimental column density, we calculated the column density. So if you take a picture of your atomic density from the top in some experiment, in this funny entangled state, and we subtracted the scenario that's sort of closest boring case. Right, so this is for a 50-50 superposition of the S and the P imprint. And then we subtract the classical mixture where you just average 50-50 the S and the P pattern. Right? Or say half of your experiments make an S state and the other half a P state. Right? And what you see is some pattern is there. And if you look at the maximum size of it for parameters that we picked, that's like 3% of the ambient column density. Right? So I think this would be a relatively challenging experiment, right? But we believe it possibly could be done if one really wants to do this. The signal is sort of a transient glimpse at decoherence, right? It's 0 at the beginning because these 2 guys are identical before the Rydberg atom has actually interacted with the BEC, right? And it's 0 at the end because this itself has decohered, right? And in between, you see a difference between these 2 guys. Any questions up to here? Okay. So that was all based, I mean, particularly the fact that we can calculate the pattern was based on having a boring quantum system. Right? There was no coupling between the S and P state. And as soon as we add that coupling, we're in trouble, because then I really have a genuinely complicated open quantum system. And therefore, we had to resort to some hi-fi open quantum system methods. This is short for non-Markovian quantum state diffusion. Mainly, we took that so that we don't have to worry whether it's Markovian or non-Markovian. And turns out it isn't, right? So what you see here as a function of microwave frequency, once we couple the S and the P state, it's again the coherence between S and P. Initially, it's 1. And the more microwave you whack on, the longer coherence gets preserved, right? Which makes sense since the microwave kind of tries to establish coherence between S and P. Right? What you also see is the coherence has these like decay and revival features. And that is typically what one sort of associates with a non-Markovian environment, right? So the environment remembers part of the history of the system and then talks back to it. And we quantified that non-Markovianity and made a nice graph, like you can tune it with microwave. Okay, so that was my decoherence of a Rydberg qubit in a BEC. And now essentially, right, so we had many atoms in an S state, 1 atom in an S plus P state, and I still have 3 minutes on the clock, right? So then the logical thing I would want to do is many atoms that can be in S or P state. And the reason why we always, anyway, want to look at that has to do with energy transport. And so there's a very, let's say, basic initial analogy between energy transport in photosynthesis and in a Rydberg system. Right, so my cartoon's picture of photosynthesis energy transport is you have these light harvesting proteins. They have a lot of these green, kind of large, nasty biomolecules. If any of those catches a photon from sunlight, it goes from the ground to an electronically excited state. That excited state can now jump to the neighboring molecule thanks to dipole-dipole interactions, and somewhere it gets eaten up and converted into some more useful energy. Right, so, but in practice, this whole thing in the biological setting is, of course, highly subject to decoherence. It's non-Markovian and it's generally a mess. If you want to know a little bit more about complications that happen there, I advertised the poster by Ritesh Pant, right? He's dealing with molecular aggregates. So this guy. Right, in a Rydberg chain, right? So now if I have a chain of a bunch of Rydberg atoms, again, they're all in a highly excited Rydberg state, mostly S state. One of them is in a P state, right? So then you know these resonant dipole-dipole interactions can also shuffle the P state from one to the neighboring atom. Now over much larger length scales than in that case, right? So the idea is now to use this as a quantum simulation platform for the energy transport, right? But then now the key feature that you need is to make it incoherent. Right, because the basic atom case, right, so here I'm showing you this experiment in the Paris group where they more or less have done that for 3 atoms already some time back. Right, so you have really the fully Schrödinger coherent time evolution of that single P excitation is jumping here between these 3 sites. Right, there is no decoherence, or I mean, there is due to technical effects, right, but not so strongly as in the molecular setting. Right, and I've already shown you how to decohere the things. We put them in a Bose-Einstein condensate. Right, it decoheres 1 atom, it also decoheres many atoms. Right, so essentially we do the whole circus again, start from that field operator now for many atoms and derive the Hamiltonian. And that then takes the form of the Holstein model, which has a sort of excitation that can jump from atom N to atom N here with dipole-dipole interactions, path of oscillators, possible on-site energy, and that sort of same coupling to phonons that I've shown you for a single atom before. Right, so this is used by the molecular aggregate people, I think also by condensed matter physicists for exciton-phonon coupling. And then we can use again that same stochastic hi-fi technique for open quantum systems that we used earlier. Right, and we start with a sort of chain of 10 atoms where my P excitation sits in the middle. This is this ballistic quantum coherent transport that you'd get without any bath. Right, you see all sorts of maxima and minima that indicate quantum coherence. And once we put it in the BEC, it all becomes much more diffuse and classical looking. Or if we play around a bit and we put this on-site energy shifts on my chain, right? So the rightmost state has the higher energy, the leftmost one's lower one. Say we do a sort of dynamic Stark shift or something like that. And we start in an eigenstate at the top initially, then you see that it nicely relaxes down the entire chain until it comes here. And then honestly, we don't yet understand what happens later. It might be wrong because all these results are like 5 days old, right? So it should be a huge preliminary printed on this slide. Okay, with that, I'd like to thank the co-workers involved in this, in particular Siddharth and Shivakant, who were the sort of it's their PhD projects that I've been talking about in these three chapters. I'd like to thank the rest of the group, just because. And then like to thank you for your attention.
Okay. So thanks, Sebastian. So I think we have time to take a couple of questions. Yes.
Hi, Sebastian. Just a couple of questions. So with the decoherence, when you looked at non-Markovian effects, I see that you're sort of driving the qubit while looking at decoherence.
Yes.
Couldn't you have started with just some superposition state and looked at decoherence to see whether it's Markovian or non-Markovian? That's the first part. The second is, why does it sort of die away? Even when you're driving, after a point, the oscillations die away and you get kind of a decay. Is this clear? Because I thought if it is non-Markovian, it's going to be non-Markovian through the entire time.
First part of the question, I mean, we started off with not driving anything, right? So that's this simple Gaussian type of decay. Whether here one can call anything Markovian or non-Markovian, I honestly don't know. We haven't checked that out, right? So I think this is because this is the sort of normal thing you get always when you decohere, right? So I guess you don't see any signature there. Honestly, I haven't thought about it, if this is enough. And the other one, right? So this doesn't fully die away later on, right? So I think if we run this for longer, what you actually see is that the coherence ends up at a sort of finite, perhaps negative value, right? So I think what that actually is reminiscent of, or what it is relaxation, right? So in the presence of the microwave, you have these two eigenstates that are S plus P, S minus P. One of them is higher energy, the other one lower energy, right? So that system actually, in the presence of that non-Markovian burst, likes to relax into the lower energy state, and that's, I think, the S minus P. This is why the coherence likes to end up negative in the end. Right? But the method has sort of both runtime and convergence problems if you do it for too long. Plus the Rydberg atom has lifetime problems, so we didn't.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Okay, I think it's quite late, so I think you can discuss with him later.
Happy to have any more questions.
So let's thank Sebastian for this wonderful talk. And